Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so in this episode, I want to try to say something about the American philosopher Henri David Thoreau and his view on the importance of solitude. Now, it seems to me that solitude is a pretty complex notion. So maybe before we talk about solitude specifically, we should first bring in some other terms and then make some distinctions and then provide some definitions. Because here's the thing. There's more than one mode of experience that has to do with being alone. And so it's important that we see the differences. Okay, but before I start, I want to preface here that in making these distinctions, I'm going to be drawing upon some of the work of the philosopher Philip Koch, someone who wrote extensively on solitude. Okay, so I would say that there are at least three other modes of experience that on the surface one might take to be very similar to solitude, but in fact, they're not. So let me run through them. Okay, so let's start with the experience of being lonely, of loneliness. So what is this exactly? Well, I would say that basically this is the feeling or the experience we have when we desperately yearn or pine to be with another person. And as we all know, this isn't a good feeling. What we need when we're lonely is, well, what we need is the remedy of engaging with another human being. Okay, so that's loneliness. Now next, we have isolation. Now, to feel isolated, well, that too involves reference to another person, but I would say it does so in a different way. So with this experience, it's not that we feel that we desperately need someone like we do when we're lonely, but it's that we feel that there's an unbridgeable space or gap between ourselves and others, that we just can't really connect. Okay, so that's isolation. And then finally, I would say that there's this mode of experience called alienation. Now, maybe we could think of alienation as a kind of close cousin of both loneliness and isolation together. That's to say, alienation is what we feel when we recognize that there's this breach or this divorce from our past or from our family or from our community. Now, these are people or groups of people that we yearn to be with, but yet we just can't. And that's because an impassable gap has grown between us. It's because the umbilical cord has been severed. Okay, now notice a few really important things about all three of these modes of experience. First of all, they're all negative experiences. And second, notice that directly or indirectly, they all center on other people that we either need or are despaired by. In other words, the point is that loneliness and isolation and alienation, they're all negative experiences, and in one way or another, they're all ultimately structured or constituted by our relation to other people. Okay, well, so here's the thing. Solitude is not like this. That's to say, first of all, solitude is for the most part a positive, constructive experience. And second, it's an experience that's marked by not being in any kind of relation to others. That's to say, you're not lonely in the absence of someone, and you don't feel isolated or alienated from others. No, in solitude, you're just disengaged or or disconnected from others, which is not the same as being in some position of pain or despair with respect to them, right? Well, so I said that solitude is largely constructive. So how is this exactly? Well, when your consciousness is not structured by others, when you drench out the reality of others which surrounds you, you become much more attentive. And the world actually opens up to you in new and manifold ways. And you begin to feel a part of it, connected to it. In a way, you could say that what solitude often brings is a kind of communion or relationship with the world, especially the natural world. Actually, this is an important difference between the three earlier types of feelings, loneliness and isolation and alienation, and solitude. These other three modes of experiences, well, they shrink your world. They cut you off from it, and they draw you inside of yourself. But with the experience of solitude, well, what often happens is that you expand into the world and you feel increasingly connected to the things around you. And so even though technically you might be alone, the absolutely last thing you ever feel is alone. The last thing you ever feel is something like loneliness or isolation. Okay, well, all of this said, I think it's time now to briefly say something about the American philosopher Henri David Thoreau. And that's because I don't think anyone has ever celebrated more the positive and the constructive aspects of solitude. Okay, but first, let me back up a bit and try to give some context here. So, if you don't know, Thoreau wrote a book called Walden, which was published in 1854. Now, this was a book based on his own experiences over the course of 2 years in a cabin that he built near Walden Pond, which was located near Massachusetts. And the main reason he did this was to try to escape what he thought of as his overly civilized existence up until then. He wanted to try to live the simple life and see what sort of effect it would have on him. Actually, before I continue with my main point, notice something interesting about Thoreau as a philosopher here. Notice that in getting out there in nature and not just sitting around, Thoreau was all about making philosophy an act, not just theory or speculation. That's what he did. He turned his thoughts and his desires into concrete attempts at something. He experimented with them by turning them into a way of life, which was his move away to a life in nature. Now, that said, I should say something else here too. And that is, to be honest, the woods that he went to live in, they weren't that remote or wild or dangerous. Actually, it turned out that Thoreau's cabin was within walking distance of a village, and that he'd even walk there to have dinner sometimes. Actually, though, it's funny and ironic. You might even say that there are millions of us today in dense cities that live in a more isolated way than he did. I mean, some of us even live in gated communities, and we have absolutely no idea who our neighbors are, right? Anyway, even though he's been perceived by others as some sort of adventurer, that's not what Thoreau was truly interested in. He didn't really care how remote his lodgings were or how wild his surroundings were. It wasn't a test to see how far out into the wilderness one could get. You don't need to live the monastic life to experience solitude and authenticity. No, to find yourself and to live the authentic life, you don't necessarily need to be at a great distance from things. Now, why is this? Well, it's because undiscovered country lies within and around us all. As Thoreau himself said, you don't find yourself any more in the wilds of Labrador than you do in some recess at Concord. His point was that we import the project of self-discovery and happiness. It's not something that's contingent on how far away that we get from things. Okay, but I began by talking about solitude. And I said that Thoreau, more than most, celebrates this experience. Actually, no, he has an entire chapter devoted to it in Walden, which is pretty amazing to read. Anyway, one thing that he says there is this. He says, I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. Now, that's what I was trying to say earlier. What the experience of solitude brings Thoreau isn't loneliness or a sense of being cut off from things, but it's the opposite. What it brings is connection. It brings a kinship with the natural world. It brings a sense of wholeness. To repeat Thoreau's own descriptions, in solitude out there on his walks, this is what he says. He says, everything is congenial to me. I'm in sympathy with the leaves. I have a little world all to myself, and so on. And then at one point he says that there can be no melancholy to him who lives in the midst of nature. You get the point, right? No melancholy. There is no melancholy in solitude. That's just something that you cannot say about loneliness or isolation or alienation. Now, if it's not already clear, we should keep in mind that for Thoreau, solitude does ultimately require some degree of asceticism or simplicity. For him, you do have to try to eliminate the unnecessary. You have to slough off your civilized self. You can only know the sublime and the companionship that solitude reveals if you first drench out that larger social and artificial reality that surrounds you all the time. Only then do you recapture your natural self, one that didn't know just how many friends it really had, and how connected to the earth it really was, and how impervious to melancholy it can actually be. Or to quote Thoreau himself, not till we are lost, in other words, not till we have lost the world, do we begin to find ourselves and realize where we are and the infinite extent of our relations. Bye for now.